And we're back. Hello. This is part two of our Westward expansion lecture. And remember, we're focusing on the essential question, how and why did people move west? And also, what kind of impact did this have on our country and various groups? So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to start off with the cattle boom, or sometimes it's called cattle kingdom. And this especially refers to our Texas roots, our Waco roots. It's actually what put Waco, Texas on the map. Believe it or not, the year 1900, 120 years ago, as I'm filming this in 2020, pandemic year. Waco, Texas was one of the largest cities in the state. We were actually, I think, the second largest city, if that's right. Um, is this still recording? I think so. Okay. Waco, Texas was put on the map because of the cattle ranges that went through our city. Waco was one of the main crossing points of the Brazos River, primarily because there was a bridge built here. Now, if you think about downtown Waco and you think about bridges, you probably are thinking of the suspension bridge. So that's why Waco became really big and prosperous. Now, the cattle kingdom and cattle boom refers to the large amount of cattle, primarily Texas Longhorn, which are a cross species between Spanish herds and English cattle um, that proliferated around the time period after the Civil War. I know we're not supposed to go into that much detail because it's an overview, like high school course and stuff. But in my college course, we talk about the Civil War. You know, you learned about the 8th grade, but we don't spend a lot of time on Texas's direct role as a state in the Civil War. And one of the things you should know here that pertains to this is that Texas actually was the beef producer for the Confederacy, the southern United States, the southern country fighting the Civil War. As the beef producer, they had all these cattle, right, grazing in the southern Texas plains there. Well, obviously, the Anaconda Plan, the strangulation, the North cuts off Texas after the Battle of Vicksburg in the Mississippi. Texas is cut off. There's nowhere for this beef to go. These cattle kind of just sitting there in the southern part of the states, just doing what, animals do. Think about bunnies. They just kind of they breed a lot, so you have all these extra herds sitting around there. It's why this cattle boom is going to take off after the Civil War, because there was all these extra head of cattle. And it's not just like the stories the westerns portray. It's not like there's some entrepreneuring, free-spirited guys from the East who decide, I'm going to become a cowboy and pull myself up by my own bootstraps. No, a lot of these cowboy ventures were actually orchestrated by major Eastern firms and corporations. In fact, two of the largest ranches and organized cowboy endeavors were owned by, I think, an English company and a Scottish company, foreign ventures. But there was a lot of money to be had. A cow that would be worth about $10. A longhorn is, named for the 5-foot spread there. It's a Spanish, like I say, English breed. But these longhorn, they could sell for about $10 down in South Texas. But once you get them up to the railheads, that's where you could load these cattle up onto trains, and then they go on the railroad east to slaughter, sorry cows, over to like Chicago, where they had the big meat packing industry. Then you could sell that same cow that you purchased for $10 down in South Texas. He'd be worth 3, 4, maybe even 5 times that amount when you got him to the railhead there in Kansas. So that's why this is a very profitable business, and there's a lot of people that come to Texas for this. Now, the cowboy game actually gets a lot of its origins, like the way cowboys dressed, the way that they herded the cattle, the way that they rode the horses, the tack that they used, like the saddle horns on their Western saddles, the stirrup guards that they would use, the lassos, the way they would lasso. All of these things kind of originated from Mexico, from the Spanish cowboys known as the vaqueros. So that's where the cowboys actually learned the trick of their trade, the tricks of their trade. It was actually from Mexico. And the Chisholm Trail, that is the trail that goes from about South Texas, like San Antonio area, up through Waco. through the Brazos River over our suspension bridge there. That's why if you are from Waco, like my students, and you go through downtown, you see the Indian Spring Park there, and you see the suspension bridge. You'll notice all these statues on the western bank of the bridge, depicting longhorns and several cowboys done in like a Frederick Remington style. Very, very beautiful statues, very detailed. That's because this was on the old Chisholm Trail, and that trail continues through Fort Worth, which was known as Cowtown, and the stockyards that were there, all the way up through Indian Country, that was Oklahoma, and then into Kansas. And the original stop would be Dodge City, but then once the railroads came through, then it was Abilene and other places in Kansas. Like I said, they'd load the cattle up on the trains there in Kansas, and then they'd ship them out for slaughter. So this is the cattle boom, and it's really going to last in the time period right after the Civil War, up through about the late 1880s. That's less than 20 years. So if you think about it, the cowboy, which is such an integral part of the mystique that makes our state of Texas, lasted for less than 2 decades. It wasn't very long. Think about the impact that it's had. Like, here's the logo of UT. Hook'em Horns, the University of Texas at Austin, one of our biggest universities, one of the most renowned schools in the world, at least in my humble opinion. It is a really big, prestigious school, UT. And the University of Texas has a Longhorn as their mascot because that was such a big part of our state. But this is the thing that only lasted for less than 2 decades, the era of the cowboy. But it's become very romanticized through things like country music. I encourage you to listen to these songs here. This is a song from one of my favorite space cowboy TV shows called Firefly, but it's very evoking of this Western mysticism and the era of the cowboy that was so short-lived. Now, the thing that will end the cattle boom will be, like most things in history, it's complicated, but a variety of factors. You have the invention of barbed wire, which is those little barbs you see on twined, I was made out of some kind of metal. I'm thinking steel, I don't know, honestly, but it's twined and it's barbed, so it's sharp. And barbed wire can really tear into an animal. We had a colt. It's a young horse that was being weaned from his mom. He was about 6-7 months old, and we were very stupid. I was 10, so I don't want any of the blame here. And we put him into a pasture that was about a mile away from our pasture with some friends. They had a little pony there, so he'd have a companion, and that way he could be away from his mom, so that they could get used to being apart and her milk could dry up. That's the weaning process for you people that have never seen an animal and have no clue. And of course, the first night that this little baby horse was by himself, there was a big storm, and you can guess, he panicked, ignored the little pony that was with him, and he ran right into the barbed wire and cut his neck to the jugular. Like, you could see it throbbing. Now, he survives this. We get him stitched up. We pump him full of, tetanus boosters and all this other stuff. But that barbed wire can do some major damage to animals, and cows will respect it, even though it's very lightweight, very affordable fencing. It doesn't take a whole lot to put it up. It is very effective at closing off the range. And a lot of farmers would use this barbed wire to enclose their farms to keep the cowboys from taking these big giant herds through their area and tromping their land and messing it up. If you think about it, you could have like just a dozen cowboys with a herd of over 1,000 head of cattle, because it didn't take a lot of people to move these cows once they're going. Herd mentality means the cows will follow the cow in front of them. So it was a very low overhead on these ventures. But barbed wire will be one of the reasons why it ends. So know that. Another reason why the cattle boom and the cattle kingdom kind of falls apart was a series of droughts. Mother Nature, I think it was 1886 through 1888, there was a series of 3 or 4 really harsh droughts. And if you can't have rain, you can't have grass. You can't have grass, you can't have cattle. Another problem was just too many cattle. there was too many cattle and they were overgrazing the land, which also caused a lack of grass. So many cattle starved, and overproduction. We're going to talk about this again and again through the course of this class, especially when we talk about economic factors for like the Great Depression and whatnot. But overproduction means you make too much of something. You have an oversupply, a surplus. And because of the enormous profit from selling these cattle when they got to the railheads, lots and lots of people were doing this and breeding more and more cattle. And eventually there were so many cattle that what happened is that the price started to go down. And so that lessened the demand for at least for these ranchers. So overproduction, the price kind of drops from what they could get, so they stopped doing this as much. And kind of by the end of this, there's only a few of those really large venture ranches, like the King's Ranch down in South Texas. Most ranches became pretty small, less than 200 head of cattle. And the very last reason why the cattle boom ends is the railroads themselves. Let me go back to the map here. You had the first railroads like in Kansas. That was the final destination of these big cattle drives, like along the Chisholm Trail. But eventually railroads start coming, into Texas that could go and take the animals to slaughter out in the East Coast and West Coast and whatnot. Railroads go through Fort Worth. Eventually railroads go through Waco, and you don't have to have these long drives anymore. You no longer have to have the cowboy of old. You can have more modern methods. You don't have to go as far and whatnot. So that is the cattle boom. And that is why we have those cattle longhorn statues there in downtown Waco by the suspension bridge. When the cattle drives came through our city, there needed to be, places for the cowboys to restock on food, for them to stay and rest. That's kind of what put Waco on the map. It's why the suspension bridge was built and what allowed our city to really flourish, so that by 1900, like I said, our city was one of the biggest in the state. Speaking of which, you can see the original facade on the suspension bridge right here in this photo of Waco, Texas in 1872, which is pretty remarkable. You see there's a wagon pulled by an oxen there. Horse-drawn wagons here, like almost a covered wagon looking there. The old dry goods grocery stores where they would resupply and whatnot. This is an amazing photo of our city from well over 100 years ago. This is 100 and almost 100, 148 years ago. It's crazy to think about that. You could see that the original facade looked very industrial or almost like medieval. Eventually, they do that over several decades later, so it looks more like the modern facade that we have today. There's the statues I was referencing. And again, there's Waco on the Chisholm Trail. There is a marker for the Chisholm Trail on the eastern bank of the suspension bridge. If you go to that side, like where the MLK Street is, you can see the Chisholm Trail marker. All the statues of the Longhorn and the Cowboys done in the Remington fashion, those are on the western bank of the river. Chisholm Trail markers on the eastern bank. All right, the last part of this lesson, we're going to talk about what this all means, the impact that westward expansion is going to have on various groups. So first off, remember the context of this time period. This is after 1865 when the Civil War ended. Reconstruction was this time period when the country was trying to mend itself back together again. Because remember, the Civil War was the North versus the South over the issue of slavery. That's what it basically boiled down to. Would the South be allowed to keep slaves? And because the North won the war, that question was answered. No, they would not be. And so legally, slavery was outlawed with the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. I know we talked about this in Unit 1, Foundations, but remember the Constitution is the law of our country. It's a document that spells out how our government is going to function, and what rights we have. Those are contained in the amendments or the add-ons to that Constitution. And so amendments 1 through 10 are the Bill of Rights. They grant you, freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the right to a trial by jury, all those sorts of things. The 13th Amendment, which ratified in 1865, right after the Civil War, that was the amendment that outlawed slavery and all forms of forced indenturitude. Now, there will be ways around this, as there will be ways around the 14th and 15th Amendments, which we'll talk about later, that the South will use to keep African Americans subjugated in various ways. But officially and legally, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, done in about 1868, a few years after the Civil War, is going to be orchestrated by the radical Republicans in Congress. These were Northern abolitionists. This is going to say that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen of our country. And as a citizen, you are entitled to equal protections under the law as all other citizens. Now, hold the front door. That's a huge deal. That's what's being fought over by the Trump administration since he came into office. The idea that even if you're a first generation immigrant that just came to this country, you have a kid here, if that kid is born here on American soil, they are a citizen. They are the same as you and I and every other person, no matter what color, no matter what ancestry, no matter what ethnicity or national origins. If you are born here, you are a citizen and you are to be treated the same under the eyes of the law as all other citizens. The Equal Protection Clause, this is a thing called due process, to be treated equally under the law. So that is the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That's a really big one, and it will be very, very important 100 years later after it was added in the 1960s during the height of the modern civil rights movement. Now, finally, the 15th Amendment, this amendment done in about 1870, 1871, it's one of those. This amendment granted African American men, not ladies, the right to vote. Now, the reason it was not African American ladies is that women of all colors, including white women, were still not able to vote. Women will not be granted the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Sorry, ladies, you'll have to wait like another 50 years after men of all colors had gotten the right to vote. And like I said, there will be ways that the South, being dominated by many white supremacists in this time period after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, will find ways around these amendments to keep African Americans in what they saw as their place. And we'll talk more about that when we get to like the early civil rights movement and we talk about segregation and Jim Crow laws. But you need to remember that these laws did fundamentally change our governing document and the legal system in the United States. So 13th Amendment freed the slaves. 14th, if you're born here, you are a citizen, supposed to be treated equally under the law, equal rights. And the 15th granted the right to vote for all men of all colors, provided you were over the age of 21 at that time. I like to remember these by thinking just one word for each of them. It's a lot easier that way. So 13th, freedom. Okay. 14th, citizenship, right? You're born here, you are a citizen. And then 15th, voting. Okay. Remember, only for men, not for ladies. So that is kind of what's going on there. And you have for these westward expanding populace, those new rights and ideas for the United States. Now, not included in any of that, of course, are the Native Americans, who are the most impacted group by westward expansion. And actually, I want to just mention with the impacts here, one of the most significant groups that we don't discuss with the cowboys, not just the Mexican cowboys, the vaqueros, who made up about 20% of the American cowhands and cowpokes and cowboys, were also the 20% of them were African American. Many former slaves, many now newly freed, newly emancipated Black men journeyed to Texas to make a profit off the cattle boom. And so a lot of the cowboys, what we typically by these old Westerns see portrayed as, hunky white men, many of them were of Mexican ancestry, many of them were African American. Cowboy was kind of just a mixture, a hodgepodge of all these different various groups, just like America itself is, which is pretty cool. But again, didn't last that long. It actually was orchestrated by big corporations in most cases. So that's that. Okay. Native Americans. So the Transcontinental Railroad, various other Western moving railroads are going to bring huge amounts of white Americans and settlers onto Native American land. Now, remember, since the beginning of our country, they were talking like way back to the time of Christopher Columbus in the late 1400s, and the Spanish conquistadors, the English settlers, the French, all these various groups from Europe that started coming and conquering and settling in the United States. Native Americans have slowly but surely been pushed off their land, off the East Coast, off of the Great Lakes, off of the Mississippi, further and further west, until by this time in the time period after the Civil War, in the late 1800s, the only last vestige of true Indian land is this Western frontier. This is it. This is their last land that they have. And now these settlers are encroaching on it. And so that's the setting for the Indian Wars, where these Native Americans try to resist that. Trains, like I said, just complicate this, bringing more settlers in, which take their land. The Homestead Act, granting 160 acres of land to these European immigrant white families, that's just taking their land. The cattle drives, all these cattle, and we didn't even mention like sheep, who actually graze even in further down to the roots, are even more destructive on the land. All of this is destroying and taking native land. And so Native Americans are going to, in some instances, fight back. And you have very heroic last stand efforts. You have great Native chieftains like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. You have a few instances where the Native Americans actually defeat the United States cavalry, like famously at Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana. But for the most part, the United States cavalry, the United States military, will be able to push the natives off their lands, either killing them or forcing them to flee to Canada, or basically capturing them and forcing them to relocate to Indian country in Oklahoma, where many of them went, or to various other reservations. And reservations are this land that natives were forced onto, that usually was given to them because it was land with very little resources, land that our governments and our settlers saw no value in. So it was given to the natives, which kind of put the Native Americans, you could see the trajectory of history in kind of the shape they are in today. You go to Native American land today, it's often, you see the reservations are very poor. Many of them live in extreme poverty. Alcoholism is rampant. You see trash everywhere because they don't have money for garbage, basic public works systems. And a lot of Native American reservations today, if they have money, it's because they're their own sovereign territories, which we'll talk about later when that's granted to them. But they're able to run things like casinos, or they'll do tours and stuff like at the Grand Canyon. But this is a very sad affair. So I want to just briefly mention one happy point. Like I said, one instance where the opposite was true, and Native Americans were able to beat the white man, and that was Custer's Last Stand. It's not the only instance, but it is probably the most famous. George Armstrong Custer was this very full of himself general from the Union during the Civil War, who was desperate to make a name for himself. He had grand political ambitions, and the best way, especially back in that time period, to become important politically, like to eventually one day become president of the United States or something, was to become a big war hero. Think about like George Washington. He was the general of the Continental Army, or Andrew Jackson, the winner at the Battle of New Orleans. They were generals, heroes. And so that's what Custer wanted. He was looking for fights. and the fight to be had was against Native Americans out in the West. And so Custer and a regiment, about 200 of his men, detached from their bigger 7th Cavalry unit, and they came upon the Native American encampment there. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had rendezvoused, and there were several thousand Native American warriors there, which usually the cavalry would pick on like a few hundred warriors with lots of Native women and children. These were like thousands of warriors. So Custer was dramatically outnumbered, but he goes in anyway, very foolhardy, thinking he had the element of surprise, and gets his butt handed to him. The Native Americans call Custer's last stand the Battle of Greasy Grass, because the tall grass was blowing in the wind, but it covered all the bodies. Custer and the last of his men who survived the initial attack rendezvoused on a hill. And for cavalrymen, they did kind of the last desperate effort that one can commit. They shot their horses to use for shields at the top of this hill, Last Stand Hill. And that's where finally their bodies were discovered later after the battle, with arrows full of them. There was only one survivor of this battle. It was a horse, ironically named Comanche, yet owned by one of the U.S. cavalry commanders under Custer's control. So this was a U.S. government horse. The military found the horse after the battle, kind of bleeding and running around, obviously, you know, freaking out because of the pain. It had several arrows still lodged in it. And this horse named Comanche, the survivor, was basically treated as a hero, and lived the rest of his life, a very old age, at a fort in Kansas. And then eventually, after he died, kind of morbid, but it's interesting, they stuffed him and preserved his body, and it's now on display still there at the Kansas State Medical School. The Kansas State has a veterinary hospital, or not veterinary hospital, it's, you know, a veterinary college, basically, at Kansas State. And they have the horse's body behind glass on display, Comanche, if you want to look it up. Last thing for our lesson today, even though the Native Americans will lose the Indian Wars and everything else, that's not the end of the story. It gets even worse, so hang on to your hats. The U.S. government in 1887, Congress will pass the Dawes Act, which will legally strip the Native Americans of their land. And that's what that political cartoon is showing there. The government's chomping, taking away the native land. This was done basically kind of, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I'm getting tired. But they're going to divide Native American land into 160-acre plots. Think of the Homestead Act. You know, land was divided in the West into 160 acres that an immigrant family would purchase basically for free, you know, or $1.25 per acre. It was almost for free. It was very similar to the Dawes Act. Native Americans, instead of owning the land as a tribal unit, they would have their tribal lands divided up into these 160-acre plots. Now, if you're a family, you got 160 acres. It was something like if you were a single man without a family, you would get half of that, like 80 acres. If you were a young man promised this land, you get half of that, like 40 acres, whatnot. So the land would be divided up. And you could get this land if you agreed to assimilate, adopt the customs of the white man, which meant what? Think culture, customs, that include things like how you dress, what you eat, how you speak. That means speaking English. Not that I can do that very well right now, of course. But you'd have to adopt the customs and culture of the white man, speak English, dress white, all those sorts of things. And own this land as a single family unit and not as a tribe. Now, this goes against Native American beliefs and customs that they've had since the dawn of antiquity. Most Native cultures believe that the land is not owned by like a private person, that the land belongs to the collective for everybody's use. We share the land. But this was done also by the government. Like I said, it was a land grab. So the land that was not divided up, or Native Americans that the government saw as refusing to comply, that land was taken and the excess was given to the government. And that's how the government stole about 2/3 of the Native American land. Now remember that many Native Americans fought back against this, and they were killed in the Indian Wars, which created a lot of orphans. Many orphans, Native American children, would end up basically being sent off to these academies on the East Coast, in big eastern cities. And in these Native American schools, boarding schools, they would be forced to give up their own culture. They'd be forced to cut their hair, forced to speak English, forced to give up everything that made them Native American and adopt the cultures and habits of the white man. So here's a picture for that. Let me move this. At one of these boarding schools, you could see the Native American kids as they came in, and then this is what was done to them under the Dawes Act. That's called assimilation, by the way. Assimilation means you are forced to fit in. You're forced to act a certain way. In this case, their assimilation is they're being Americanized. They're forced to act, speak, look American. This is a picture here of one of the massacres. I believe that might be at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee was in the Dakotas, an instance where Native Americans congregated for a ghost dance. Ghost dances are where they basically came together to pray and dance around a circle and pray for the white man to leave and for Native Americans to be able to have their land again. So it was a peaceful demonstration. But the cavalry got twitchy and guns were fired, and eventually a whole bunch of innocent Native American women and children and old men were slaughtered by the US government. And the US government, one of the reasons that we were victorious was because we had better weapons. Here's like a early machine gun called a Gatling gun, prototype that will later be perfected and used to extreme sense, and it was like the Maxim gun in World War I. Here's an advertisement for Indian land. I'm not even trying to hide it there. But yeah, 2/3 of Native American land stolen with the Dawes Act. All right. So on that depressing note, remember, you now have a summary to write. So how do you do that? Well, go back to your essential question. How and why was the West settled, and what impact did this have for various social groups? Look through the notes that you've taken thus far. So how was the West settled? Think about, like, how did people get out West? All right. So, okay. Why did people go out West? Think push and pull factors. We mainly focused on pull factors. So what were the pull factors that led people, that drew people out West? You had stuff like this, and then you had stuff like this. Specifically mentioned this. You had stuff like this, also pull. Okay. And then the last part of that essential question, don't forget, what impact did this have on various social groups? We talked about opportunities for like African Americans, maybe with like the cowboy ventures and stuff with the cattle boom. But the main impact we talked about, of course, was with this group here. Okay, and what happened to them. So that would be the final part of your essential question. Is there a certain length that your summary has to be to answer the essential question? No, it just has to make sure that it completely answers it and all of its parts. So if you're a very good writer, you could maybe answer this in 1 to 2 sentences, very full sentences. You might need to answer this in like 4 to 5 sentences. However long it takes you to answer your summary, that'll depend on, how long it takes you to answer this question. So that's what you are doing, and you're going to write that summary where you answer that question right here, and you're going to use your notes to do that. And remember, you're going to submit those notes on Google Classroom. All right, that is it for today. Thank you guys very, very much. I appreciate it.